Good evening. This is Wednesday, April 12th, 2023. This is our Committee of the Whole regularly scheduled Board of Education meeting here at 5:30 in district office. I'm calling the meeting to order at 5:30. If you could please call the roll.
Mrs. Hassler,
Here.
Mrs. Arvanitis,
Here.
Mrs. Troutman,
Here.
Mr. Kaczynski, Mr. Collins, Mrs. Stufen,
Here.
and Mrs. Caforio.
Here. So we have 5 board members present, 2 absent. If we could please stand for the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, public comments?
There are none.
None? Okay, there's no one signed up, so we will move on. Just kind of a reminder that our Committee of the Whole is an opportunity for us to dig into a topic, which for the last 3, we've been digging into our data, academic data, and looking at where we are, where we need to go, and tonight we're going to look at the metrics around this strategic plan and discuss those. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Campbell, who's going to do a short introduction and get us started, and that's it. All right, over to you.
Okay. So as you've stated, we have engaged in prior presentations to provide greater insight into the process of our strategic plan, specifically with phase 1 and 2. And at our last Committee of the Whole meeting, we had the opportunity to delve deeper into phase 3. And part of that work was allowed us to look more specifically at the following components of the strategic plan, being the strategies, the strategic indicators, some draft benchmarks, as well as some action planning steps that have been taken. So the district administration team has continued to work collaboratively with school teams to accomplish the following: the monitoring of the effectiveness and making adjustments to our resources, our practices, as well as our programming that we continue to bring forward to the board and our community to ensure that we are providing a guaranteed and viable curriculum. And one of the elements within our work over the last year and a half has been to utilize data-driven decision-making to really identify how we can be most responsive to the needs of our students so that we can continue to accelerate outcomes and student achievement. As the leadership team has continued to engage and will continue to engage in the forward moving of phase 3 implementation, there was presented an opportunity for us to deepen our understanding of a particular framework, an evidence-based framework that will allow the Board of Education, in partnership with our administration, to review goals as well as adjust and set goals that are based on our historical and localized student performance. I'm really pleased because of the direction that the Board of Education has provided the administration to make sure that we are really targeting and being responsive to our student needs, that they're creating an opportunity for us to bring in a partner to really help us really dive deeply into the analysis so that we are doing it in a very informed and in systemic manner. So with that being said, we have, and I've had the privilege of learning alongside, as well as spending countless conversations with Dr. Gina Semenuk. And Dr. Gina Semenuk is the president of ECRA Group and is responsible for the overall alignment. I'm sorry, I'm looking at my colleague. I thought he was trying to give me a little bit of a message. the overall alignment, as well as the integration. Oh, you were giving me, because I practiced actually, Dr. Gina, on saying your last name. I said I was not going to botch it. So that's what you were giving me, that positive reinforcement in the moment. You did it. You did it. Dr. Simonik, she actually is the president of the ECRA group and responsible for the overall alignment and integration, as well as delivery of all of the various services offered. She specifically oversees, oversees the research and the analytics, as well as the business development and of the team and the services that are delivered to many of their partners. We are so pleased for her to come today, and she's going to lead our board and our administration through learning, and then have the opportunity for us to begin to look at some very specific reports, and then at the end for the Board of Education to have the opportunity to really think about how they would like to make some adjustments or recommendations or advisement as it relates to the goals that have been set. So without further ado, I would like to call up Dr. Gina Simonik.
She must have practiced that. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Nice to meet everyone. There's Scott. I thought you were over there. Musical chairs. So yes, the name is not easy. The eyes are silent. That's the trick. Just pretend they aren't there. So what we're going to do is, let me, here, it's an agenda slide. Does everybody have the printed slides as well? Okay, so we're going to try to break this evening up into 3 sections. The first will really be a learning and a little deeper presentation of our analytic framework, and then we'll pause and give you an opportunity to just ask questions and check your understanding a little bit, if you have any questions about that. But then the second part, we want you to actually think about that framework and look at some actual data of the district, specifically the growth from the 21-22 school year, the academic growth, and think about, through that framework, I'm going to walk you through a way to think about how do you set growth goals. And then I'll have each of you in your teams here in your tabletop look at some reports, have some discussion, and then if you think about one person reporting out like a minute very quickly what your discussion was and what your thoughts are around academic goals. I want it to be as engaging and interactive, and still give you an opportunity to actually apply some of what I'm going to walk you through in this first section. And then the last section we're going to do very similar. I'm going to talk about how you use this framework to think about setting your proficiency goals. And I know you do have some already out there on your dashboard, so we'll take a look at that. I want you to look at what's currently being held for those goals, and then another way of thinking about that. And we'll do a brief report out. Sound good? Okay. So I'm going to start now, and I'm sure everybody in this room understands that there is a difference between proficiency and growth. They are often used interchangeably, so I'm just going to make sure that that I just walk through a little bit here, because they're both important, and we know that in the long run, that aggregate level of proficiency that's monitored is really critical. That is still the end game. We want all students to be able to demonstrate that they're proficient against some standards. But it's really referencing, it can be a point in time, it can be an individual student's score on a test, it may be the percentage of students that are meeting some proficiency bar that's related to a specific test. Growth, on the other hand, that's looking at how students learn and grow across multiple assessments over time. Growth is a more equitable approach when you're trying to assess your improvement efforts. And we're going to talk a little bit about why that is and why it's a more equitable approach. But they're both important. And when you're looking at academic growth, it's really important whenever possible that you interpret that through the lens of proficiency. So you always want to know, is the growth good enough? Well, that depends on if they're proficient. So that's what we mean by trying to look at them together. So really leveraging predictive analytics. So ECRA, that's the foundation of what we do. We really strive to develop rigorous approaches to measuring student growth and helping you connect that growth to student outcomes, and provide a framework that allows you greater visibility into what's working, so that you understand which programs, which interventions, what are the things that we're investing in, and what's the impact. We do that by studying longitudinal historical assessments through the district, and we create local norms. And from there, we are then able to look at each and every individual student and create personalized projections that are based on how that student has performed historically, and then comparing that to the local norms to say what would we expect given everything we know longitudinally on each and every student. this is another visual to help you understand the framework. And if all you remember out of here is it's the projected versus actual, that's the key. If you're trying to make some judgment about something that the board here has agreed to invest in or a program that you've brought in, at some point you have to know what's your return on that investment. So in schools, when you're looking at programs, that's really academic ROI, academic return on investment. If students are coming to school, they're learning, and now you're going to invest maybe in maybe it's an after-school tutoring program, maybe it's a reading intervention. How do you know that that had any value above and beyond what would have typically happened anyway? It's that counterfactual. How do I know what would happen if we didn't have the program? It's very difficult to answer, because you can't keep students home because they're in a control group and don't come to school. The rest of you, let's see if it works. So the next best thing is studying individual students longitudinally, okay, and looking at multiple data points over time at the individual level. That's key, and that's how we can then extend that trajectory out to the future to say, here's what we know about Gina and how she performed throughout her entire school year last year, and here's what we know about what typically happens to students with similar performance histories in the district over multiple years. So let's carry that trajectory out, and we can make projections to the upcoming school year, to the fall, winter, and spring, if that's how your assessments align. Then as the students come to school and they take those tests, they're being taught, they come and they take the tests, we actually look at the actual and we compare, well, how did the student do compared to how the model projected? And all of that analysis occurs at the individual student level. And once we have that effect size, that growth effect size, it's a standardized metric, is how we capture that difference between the projected and actual. It's very easy to aggregate up into groups of students, into grade levels, into buildings, into a particular program. And you have it, the most critical part is getting it right at the student level. So that actually takes away a lot of the issues that you'll see when you're comparing students to the state models or to national norms, and this here is actually the slide for that. That's important to do. You have to look out the window and say, how do our kids compete? Right? You have to know that. That's when you're looking at your national benchmark tests. You know, where are they on your NWEA map? How do they perform on the College Board suite? How do they perform, you know, on the state test? What percentiles? Those are really important questions. They're not the improvement framework, though. Those answer the questions about how do our kids compete. Okay? That's a competitive race, because every student comes to school, they get started, everybody's in the pack. Think of a marathon. They all start from the front line, they all start running, the pack starts spreading out, the middle's still real thick, and at the end you have someone that's ranked, right? 99 down to 1. They're all ranked. And that framework is competitive because not all students can show favorable growth. You're just ranked, okay? And that's an important question, but it's not what you want to use if you're trying to know if your programs in your school improvement is having an impact. Local personalized models, such as what we're going to present to you tonight, that's an individual race. Every student is racing against their own personal best, so their projections are only based on their own prior history of performance. So they've already demonstrated what they can do through their own assessments, and if there are demographic variables or any characteristics that impact their performance, it's the achievement gap, we see it on every report card, so they're real. There's an impact if they're low income, if their English isn't their first language. When you're looking at that through you know, a state or a national model, those demographics are going to show. They're going to show. But when you look longitudinally at the individual student level, they're mitigated because we're only using that student's prior history. So if there's something characteristically that's impacting their performance, it's captured in all of their prior year scores. And then that's what we're using as the baseline. So if I go back a slide, that's what you see in the funnel. We put all of their data points from the prior year. From that, we distill what we call a propensity score. That's really a composite score that captures all of their information from multiple assessments. And then we use that to carry out their projections. It's done at the individual student level for every student in the district that has data. Once we have that, we can then visualize it. What you're seeing here are obviously just presentation slides. We do have a technology platform that is interactive that administrators and teachers would have access to, that they can interact with this data. The beginning of the school year is when we would normally be presenting this. So we churn all the data in the summer after all the state data comes in. We recalculate every student's growth. We close out the last school year, and we then open up the new school year with all new projections based on all the prior year's data. We plot that in the middle. There's a lot on that slide. On the bottom, the x-axis, that's that propensity or that composite score. That's what we're using for their baseline. Okay? On the y-axis, that's whatever test it is that we've projected a score to. Could be the state IER. In this example, it's MAP, NWEA MAP reading for grade 7 spring. And then that green horizontal bar in the middle, that's a proficiency bar that ECRI equates. We equate national benchmark test to the state test, so you have a common lens. If you want to know if the student in the fall is on track for the spring state test, it's all aligned. If they met that benchmark in the fall or in the winter, it means they're on track to meet the state standards in the spring. So you have a common lens of which you're making inferences about. Those blue lines, some people call that the river. That's the standard deviation, one, the top and the bottom, +1, -1. And anything in the middle, that's your local norms. That's where we expect the students to land based on their performance, which is that bottom, that propensity score on the bottom. So if you look from that x-axis up, if in the middle of those two vertical bars, it's 100, we standardize that composite score for every grade level. Again, so you have a common lens. The bulk of your students will fall within a standard deviation of that, so those are those two vertical bars. Okay, about 68% of your students are in there. To the left of that, if that propensity score to the left of that vertical bar, it's at 84, that's a standard deviation lower than the average, indicating that student has struggled on many tests last year. We know that because they're much lower, they're statistically a standard deviation lower. If they're above a standard deviation, 116, those are your higher performing students to the right of that. So at a glance, you can just see where they're projected. You know who's not projected to meet that horizontal bar. In the beginning of the year, you know where are the kids that we need to focus on. So the tools would allow you to identify the kids below that bar and then start intervening sooner, look at your targeted strategies. What else do we know about the kids? Does the student have an IEP? Are they part of any other programs or interventions? Do they need to be looked at more closely? Okay, so this is information given at the beginning of the year. As the students come to school and take the tests, we receive the data, we plot where they actually landed. So now you're looking at growth. And growth is vertically. The student will never shift left or right because that composite score was their baseline. So we look and say, where did they actually land? And if they're above that top blue line, they grew significantly higher than what was expected, given your local norms and their own past performance. If they're below that bottom blue line, they grew at significantly lower rates. And if they're in the middle of the two blue lines, that's what would have typically happened or what is expected. It could be positive or negative. It's random fluctuation at that point. So if you're trying to make an inference about a program or an intervention or did anything add value, you're looking to see that it accelerated growth. I'm going to come back to this slide in a minute because I want to point out a certain grouping on here. Once we have all of the growth scores at the individual student level, they have to shift a full standard deviation. When we start to add students together in groups, we use an effect size. It's centered at 0. The mean is 0. And the standard deviation at the student level is 1, but at a group level, it's 0.3. And we've selected that, we've anchored that based on research and in the literature. Some of you may be familiar with Hattie's effect size if you've heard that. He tends to use a 0.4. The research will say anything between a 0.2 and 0.4 is relevant in education, and that's what you're looking for. How big of an effect size means that something really happened and it's important and relevant in education. So we've anchored right in the middle of that to the 0.3. So we run 2 tests. We check, is it statistically significant? And if it's not, we don't care how big the effect size is. There's not enough evidence to say it's just random. So it just stays color-coded as green, and it's what we would have expected. But if it's statistically significant, we then want to look at that effect size and say, okay, how big? What's the magnitude of that shift? And if it's between the absolute values of 0.3, it's in that expected range, it's green. And if it's above positive 0.30, it's blue. Lower than the negative 0.3 is either yellow or red. So again, green is only good enough if you like where the students are in terms of their levels of proficiency. Green means you're keeping pace with your historical norms. For many students, that's going to be enough. It's going to be great. For students that are not yet proficient, they have to be accelerated, and you're looking for blue growth. So that framework, the idea of projected versus actual, local norms, personalized projections for each and every student, that is a very systemic framework. It links into most things that you do in schools on a daily basis. You're going to be able to monitor individual students. learning and progress. You're going to look at through the lens of RTI and MTSS. I believe it's one of the most powerful uses for this because you get that information in the beginning of the year. You can intervene sooner. You don't have to wait for the student to come in the fall, take their first benchmark test, and say, okay, you're going to know that before they come in the door, before the fall starts, and you can already start your groupings and start looking at your programs and interventions. District and school improvement goals, that's what we're talking about tonight. And then program evaluation, that academic ROI that I mentioned, that's very easy. It's the same model. You just have to keep track of what programs and interventions the students are being served with, and it will return an effect size and categorize the impact for you. It'll quantify the impact. Educational equity and impact, what we mean by that is the ability to look at all your student groups and ensure that groups are, everybody's benefiting, all students are able to benefit from the educational experience here. So that is, in a nutshell, the framework. So I'm going to pause and see if you have questions, comments, before we move on to actually looking at some of the data. No questions? Thoughts? Does it make sense? Sure.
We as a district have typically outperformed national and state averages. So help me understand how you use your data, how we will use your data, right? To know where that is and to make sure our students continue that trajectory.
Yep. So that's the slide where I talked about that's looking outside the window of how you compete. You're going to continue to do that. This isn't going to replace that idea. So in fact, if the assessment itself reports a national ranking, like MAP NWEA, College Board reports a national percentile, that's also in our reports inside of the tools that the administrators and educators would have access to, so you can still look at that. There's no difference on that. We don't use the national norms for our modeling. We use the raw data. We take it out of the architecture of the assessment. We're pretty much test agnostic. We're just looking at the actual performance in the subject of the students. So all of that other national information would still be useful. You just have to understand when to look at it. That answers a different question. So you look at that the same reason you do today. How are we competing against our, the rest of the nation or the state? And that's a very important question. But if you're trying to improve that, you want to look at your local growth, because that's going to help you know what to keep doing and what maybe you should reallocate if it's not working. You can't answer that looking at national data.
Are you going to say anything? Okay. So I just have a question, or maybe it's a clarification. So kind of going back, I'm on the slide with all the
The growth? That one?
Yes, there we
Okay.
go. So, I think something that is hard as a board member to kind of wrap your head around is, so you want kids to be proficient, but yet, if a kid hits a proficiency early, you don't want them to stop growing, right? So, and I think that is where, how do you kind of measure, how do we as board members see those two components working together? So is that what that is basically doing?
Yeah, exactly. The pointer won't work from here, right? Oh, not on the screen.
It was for a
though.
minute.
Not on the screen, okay. Can I leave this mic? Is it okay?
Yeah, just grab one of these,
I'll hold this.
yeah, perfect.
Okay. So this green bar is your proficiency line, okay? This is the propensity score that ECRA creates for each student, okay? And we standardize it, so the mean score is 100. The standard deviation is 16, which that's why we have these slices at 84 and 116, plus 1, minus 1. 68% of your students will fall here. This particular composite score, think of it as a normal distribution, okay? Bulk of your kids here, 16% will be above and 16 below. If you're lower than 84, those are struggling learners, and that's why their projections are much lower, and they're not projected, many of them, to be proficient. When you come here above 116, those are your high-performing students. the blue lines are what represent your local norms. So if you're above that blue line, those are kids that are growing at higher than expected rates, and those are your high performing kids. If they're below the blue line and above the green, they're proficient, but they're growing at significantly lower rates. So if you don't have the visibility into all students, you might not be looking at these kids because they're proficient. You're not worried about them, but they're falling significantly lower academically. And some of them, including here, this one's already below, they were supposed to be well above. So they're going to start missing these really important benchmarks. You know, in this example is 7th grade, but you know, think about this in high school if they're missing the college readiness benchmarks, which IAR is aligned to. That's why it's such a difficult benchmark. It's more difficult to reach than the College Board. It's a very rigorous bar in the state of Illinois.
So we could really have, sorry to interrupt, but just kind of recap, you could really have kids who are proficient, but we, like that, in that triangle kind of, they're not really growing.
Right, they're falling further behind, and you know what, if you go to the principal of the building, because they can whittle it all the way down, they're gonna know those kids. Someone in that building is gonna know those kids and go, oh, you know, something happened, whatever. They're gonna add all that local context. We're looking at this one test at a time, because we make a projection to every test, and then we evaluate it. So you have to keep that in mind. What do we know about that day? What happened with those students? But if it's happening 1 test, 2 tests, they're going to continue to fall, and then next year they're going to be probably not even projected to meet that bar, so that's important. You're also, you know what, maybe they're just not enough rigor, maybe they're bored. Those are the things you have to dig into. One thing to be mindful of is this model is not, it's not diagnostic, it's not going to tell us why. That's what your educators are for, that's what the experts in the classrooms and the buildings, that's their job. Right, so they're going to have to go figure out why and dig into the actual test to say, you know, what components of the reading test, you know, did Gina not do so well on? Because they have that data. They can break that down, you know, by the subclaims on the state test or the goal areas of NWEA. Similarly here, these lower performing kids, they were all projected here, so none of them were projected to be proficient. Some of them, at least this one, and this one's right on the line, and anybody above the blue line, significantly higher than expected growth. So what was in their water? What'd they get? Because whatever they got worked. They grew significantly higher. And then you have this large group below, they're falling further behind. So then you have to start digging into the individual student data, say what else do we know about these kids? Do they have any strategies, any supports in place? Do they have an IEP? And if they do, are they you know, receiving the services? Are the services working? You start to actually keep track of that to understand whether or not it's working. Maybe that something needs to be adjusted. But you don't want to wait till spring and look back and say, what happened? This is using predictive modeling, so you're able to identify kids in the beginning, put something in place, and then come and see if it worked. Did they grow at higher rates? But think about through the lens of if you're only looking at moving your aggregate numbers of proficiency. And this gets at the piece about equity for all kids and why it's a more equitable framework to measure your improvement efforts. You're setting goals, you're setting up some strategies, you're bringing in programming, you're doing something this year to help kids, more kids become proficient. If you're only looking at the percent and did I move by 2 or 3%, you're gonna lose all this high growth because they're not proficient, but they're growing at significantly higher rates, and you wanna know what program's helping them, because the whole purpose is to understand if what you're doing is working. So you would lose that if you don't have that level of visibility.
Okay, thanks.
Anything else while I'm here?
Yeah,
Well, not for me.
Should I
but-
stay?
I did want to comment, because the thing that I took the notes about listening to you was that this was the most significant gain out of looking at data this way. And I think we just have to stop thinking about proficiency and recognize that growth is what will help our kids succeed in the long term. And, you know, kids grow at different ways. And I want to make sure that all of our resources are being allocated for all kids to see growth, whether it's, you know, the bottom 16%, the top 16%, or that 68%. We have to prioritize growth for all of our kids across the board, because that's how we'll keep moving forward. And so when the community looks at this and tries to understand it, I think they need to remember that this is about growth for every kid, no matter where that kid
Right.
falls in this kind of graph.
Exactly, and growth is the means to getting more students proficient. And even your high kids, a lot of people will say, well, the high-performing kids aren't growing, but not in this framework. It's true if you're looking at it through a test publisher's growth framework, because it's just a function of they use a single predictor, it's a linear model, it's national norms. Imagine if we fit a straight line through here, a linear model. The lower kids are closer to the line than the higher kids, so that's not really what's happening. It's just it's a constraint in the approach, in the modeling. We model the data. We don't fit the kids to a model. We model the data. So you're going to see much better performance or capturing what really occurs at the tails, the lower and the higher distribution, so it's more accurate.
And I think if we don't recognize, like those, that top 16%, those kids underneath the projected that aren't meeting their growth potential, if we don't recognize that something's wrong there, then they're gonna start
They'll
falling
fall,
back
yeah.
into that 68% in the years moving forward. And so it's just as significant looking at those kids that are not meeting their growth
Right.
potential in the top 16 as it is understanding what's going on in the bottom 16. So,
And, yeah, exactly. And when we make a projection, we don't call it the goal for the students. The goal is to beat the projection. I know a lot of test publishers say, here's your growth goal. When we make a projection, that just means this is where you're likely to land if you do nothing different. And if you're up here and you meet your projection, you're okay. But if you're here and you're only meeting the projection, you're not getting over that bar, so you have to accelerate growth.
Okay. I don't know. So I'm thinking about it, because we haven't talked about this in a long time, right? So we're here today to look at the entire district in its totality. So the question is, do we also have the capability, and are we thinking about it from, like you said, building level, and I know that they're working on it, okay? Easy to answer that one. Grade level, I know grade levels work on it. We talked about that in the past. But what I'm seeing a potential for this is, you mentioned it, like all the IEP students or all the whatever student. So are we able to easily, I'm going to use that word, grasp, different pockets, because that's the only way you're finally going to get to return on investment. And you're going to be able to tie I'm going to call it a program, but, just because you use it, whatever intervention, that's exactly right. That's the only way that you're going to see whether that was worth your investment from are those students that it's targeted with, is it working for them?
Right, and so if you do that based on, again, just are they proficient, think about that to the left, the kids that are, to the left of 84 and above that top blue line that are not proficient. You may make faulty assumptions because they're not proficient and think that your improvement efforts did not work, and you may reallocate or say this program's not working. If all you're looking at is did it help them become proficient, and you're going to miss that they are growing at significantly higher rates. And this is a scientific framework. If you want to be serious about leading with data and be more evidence-based, this is a very rigorous scientific model. You're not going to get that out of a test publisher's box. They're not going to churn individual longitudinal and build your local data. Yes.
And then this is something that we could do for all different assessments. So it might tell us if there's a certain type of test that a child is struggling with, a format, or maybe they need some help in test prep first. Maybe the writing tests they're struggling with, but on the other tests, they're doing great. So it might help us to aid them in that test preparation as well.
So it works, it has to be a standardized, universally administered test. So if you're doing the NWA MAP assessment 3 times a year, and the state test in the spring, and then high school, college suite, college board suite, that's the type of data that we put in here. Now, how you help the student, how does it inform instruction? That's where when you get into the classroom at the individual student level, you have to dig into the test diagnostically. So if it's MAP and the student didn't grow well on this 7th grade reading test on MAP, how do we help them? You dig into the sub-goal areas, those learning continuums of the assessment, and that will inform for instruction, where did Gina struggle? Was it, whatever the different components are. Literacy, I don't know what they all are, but there's
Specific areas.
very specific content areas that they could then use.
And then it would also tell you comparison-wise for each assessment if there was just one that was an outlier or something,
Oh,
like
yeah.
you said, something happened that
Absolutely.
day, or what was it that, and, it helps you to look at all those
Oh, yeah.
tests separately in that
They can
same
pull it
range.
for the individual student level and have a very robust, it would go back to as much historical data since the student was in the district, and it would show, their performance and what the scores are in all those subclaim areas as well.
That's helpful, thank you.
Okay, I'm going to have you dig in. I want to talk a little bit about one of the packets that you have. I have to come closer to read my own notes. Thanks. Okay, so goal setting for school improvement. So how do we apply this? And you've heard me say this, the fundamental purpose of setting goals is to assess if they're effectively helping you, right, with your improvement efforts. The process rests on the inferences that you can actually make from meeting a goal. What does it mean if you meet the goal? So a typical improvement goal might be to increase the percentage of students meeting standards in grade 3 reading, for example, by 5%. That's very common. 2.5%, 3%, whatever that is. That's specific and measurable. You start thinking about that through the lens of a SMART goal, but it doesn't give you any information in terms of how effective your improvement efforts were. Okay? It's an arbitrary number. It's probably not linked to any real student performance, and it's not evidence-based. Okay? It's very common. We see this across, the nation. It's a very common way to set goals. To scientifically and equitably assess improvement efforts, you have to focus on student growth, and we've explained why, I've shown why. And when you use a framework like this, it will help you set goals for both academic growth as well as your aggregate proficiency goals. So what we're going to start with here is, let me back up here, projection-based goals. So this is just, actually, it's a refresher. You've seen this. This is where we're generating from past performance. We make projections at the individual student level. Once that's done, we can aggregate it to any subgroup or group of students, and then that will help you make more evidence-based decisions. So this, you have a packet. I want you to pull out the growth packet. It's the more colorful one. Okay? This is your real data from spring, so I'm going to leave this and go back. Oh, thank you. That's better. Thank you. Okay. Is that good? No, I think we're good, because they have it on paper. So I have a paper copy as well. All I have on the bottom is your bottom row. Can you hear me? Okay. So let's look at this packet together in here. So this is spring of 2022, and this does include grades 4 through 9. This is just looking at how did you end last spring. There's a reason why we don't have some of the high school. As you saw, we use the prior year's data to make projections to the next school year. Because there was no PSAT in 9 and 10 for a couple years, we won't be able to actually evaluate that until this spring. But grade 9, we were able to use 8th grade. So we could link different assessments and test publishers together. Is it too far away? Is that all right? Okay, thank you. Okay, so this packet, I want you to turn to page 3. And what you're looking at there is the overall growth, and it's just here on your packet. The overall growth, the thresholds are on the bottom there. You're going to see the blue is if you have that absolute value of 0.3. The district overall growth for the 21-22 school year is a positive 0.32 blue at the district level. I have to tell you, we don't see that often at a district level. It is very difficult to move. In this case, again, because we need the prior year's data as predictors, you're going to see that your counts are a little lower. There are 2,612 students in this. That's who we were able to match up with the predictors, okay? We don't typically see blue growth at a district level, and I know, Kevin, you have some experience in seeing this data, and it is not typical. So you understand when we build the local norms, they're built to reflect what's typical, which means it's centered at 0. The model is centered at the district level to be 0. And if you just keep pace with your local norms, it's going to be 0 every year. When you have evidence that you're doing something that is adding value and growing kids at higher rates, that number starts to shift, and you hope it shifts positive. We see it fluctuate yellow. Sometimes a building will be yellow or red. I don't see any building yellow or red. I see some green. And even the green buildings, most of them are trending positive. That just means they're keeping pace. A lot of blue. But if we turn to page 4, it'll cycle by subject. So here's your ELA growth, which was tremendous. I wouldn't expect this every year. That's the important piece. Is there's, students were really, there was a great loss in terms of the momentum that students had through COVID. So this growth from 21 to 22 is tremendous, significant. It's almost a half a standard deviation at the district level. I mean, the administrators and the teachers, it's very commendable, not easy to do. The next page will cycle by mathematics. That's in the green overall, but you're going to see many buildings accelerated learning. So very quickly, the superintendent and the district office have the ability to just look very quickly and know who's growing at accelerated rates. Are there any yellow buildings? Do they need to get in there and see if there's more resources needed, or what's the issue? Where is the blue growth occurring? Because we want to walk through those buildings and find out what's working so we can share that information, in other areas. Yes.
Can I just ask, what is the student count? And I see the little arrow thing that says only includes students with at least 2 predictors.
Right, so they have to have at least 2 predictors from the prior school year to be in this model, in the report. That's where we talk about the multiple predictors. If they aren't here last year, they're not in this report. If students didn't take the prior year tests, at least one test that has at least 2 predictors, like 2 data points, they're not in here. That's why the
And this
numbers
is-
are lower.
This is an entire building that we're looking at, these first by school, right?
Yes.
It just, I just worry that, there's about 500 kids at Lincoln Elementary, and we're only looking at 79, so what am I missing?
Yeah.
Because they were dispersed.
It's a good question for everybody.
We just talked about this at our table. So for elementaries, right, no K through 3rd grader is going to be included in the student count because they didn't have data from 2nd grade for last year.
And
Is
this
that
is
correct?
IAR, actually.
For
That's a good
IAR,
point. This is
yes.
IAR, so that's, the front page shows, the front page shows our grades. This is looking at grades 4 through 9.
Okay, so, but that still is a very, not a good number of,
So Lincoln, because of the construction, those students would have been
so the
dispersed
numbers are
elsewhere.
incorporated into
Yeah.
Edison.
So they may be lower
No, I mean,
in
Edison's
other
only
schools in
86.
certain areas, but specifically Lincoln's may be low because those students, in terms of the books, may actually show up in another
Fifth
location.
graders went to Bryan.
Yeah.
Okay,
Oh.
got it,
And-
that makes sense, thank
And
you.
even when we look at the projections, there's many more students, and once you start moving forward with consistent, use of the national benchmark map, if that's the test you continue to use, you'll be able to layer that down to whatever grade. So if it's administered K-8, you can get growth K-8. For kindergarten, you have to start somewhere. We have to go fall to spring, but every other grade, we use the entire prior school year for that baseline. Okay? Yeah, no problem. Okay, and so it cycles by subjects, by building, and then now you're looking at the grade levels on the next page. So again, very quickly, this is the type of data that I find to be most helpful in a board meeting, in a public board setting, is to look at the grade levels across the district, so you can very quickly see, is there a particular grade level that we may need to dig into a little bit more, for resources, or is there a particular grade level district-wide that is accelerating growth? And then the administrators and principals can dig into, is that true in all buildings? Is it true in only 1 or 2 buildings? So they can use it like a flashlight. Where do I need to go? Where do I need to look to see that we're, optimizing all of our tools? And then the last 2 pages will break this down by your student groups. And this, again, in addition to these are the demographic groups, the federal designation groups, you can also picture yourself adding filters for programs here. Who was served with a reading intervention, or after-school program, or a prep, SAT prep, for example. As long as you're keeping track of the programs, there would be a program sheet as well. I'm looking at the ELA on page 8, and I just want to take a look at, go down to the IEP. So I'm looking at the group of IEP students, 373 students, right? And you see 19% of them, if you read across that row, are meeting the benchmark. And then below that are the students that don't have an IEP, and 60% of them are meeting the benchmark. That's your achievement gap, okay? That's what we see often. But now look across all the way to the right to both of those rows for growth. And the students with an IEP are growing green, means they're keeping pace with your local norms. The students without an IEP are growing blue at 0.47. So what do you think's happening to that achievement gap? It's getting wider, okay? For that to close, you have to accelerate the growth for the group that have historically performed lower. They have to grow at faster rates. So you have to grow them blue. And those numbers are usually more manageable when you start to break them down within the buildings and the grade levels. You're looking at district level numbers here. And then you start to identify those students sooner. Are they receiving the right supports? Are they working? Do they need more of something? Do they need something different? This is shining the light, but you have to have the professional experts, the educators, dig into how we help them. Similarly, at the top, your English learners now, 11% meet benchmark, 58% if they're not an English learner, but they're both growing blue. That's great. We want everybody to be accelerated. Keep growing the lower group blue where they're not proficient, and more of them will get over that bar. Okay? And then for mathematics, you'll see there's not as much blue, so you can see a lot of the accelerated growth really occurred in ELA for these groups. Okay, so I want you to think about this for a minute in terms of growth goals. And what I have on the screen here now is, and I don't know if you already had a way of setting goals around growth. Not really? Okay. So perfect. I'll offer you something for you to consider. As I said a few minutes ago, we build the model to reflect typical growth, meaning that the growth framework at the district is centered at 0. Okay, your growth at the district level was 0.32. Okay, significantly higher than expected. On that page 3 on the bottom, and that's the bottom page that I have up on the screen there, that expected shows that distribution where we would expect 16% to be high growth, 68% expected, and then 16% in the low growth. And when you see that distribution, it's centered at 0, that bottom expected row that I have outlined in the red box on the screen. Okay, so a goal around academic growth, there's a couple ways to think about it. You can set it to say we have to outperform with an effect size. We have to have, positive 0.30. That's not likely to keep happening at the district level. This is very difficult to do, what you've achieved here last school year. It's not easy to do. If you want to go with an effect size, then you have to just think about making sure your community is clear in understanding that. You might not, I don't typically recommend that because it's just not everybody's familiar with effect sizes. Another way to do it is just outperform the distribution. The model is set at 0, so we have that 16%, 68 and 16. Outperform that and push the model so that you have more kids achieving expected growth and higher than expected growth. So if you add those two columns, 68 and 16, you have 84%. So by definition, we would expect 84% of students to either meet their expected growth or achieve higher than expected growth. So a way to set that goal that's data-driven would be to have greater than 85% or more students achieve higher than expected or expected growth. So 2 ways using data. You can go with an effect size and say we want to have greater than 0.30 or something, or you can just say let's outperform the distribution and have more students, greater than 85% or more students. So have a little discussion and then at your tables, and I'm going to have you report out on what your thoughts are. Okay, I'm going to have everyone come back together and share a little bit of their discussions. Slide out. Oh, thank you. Okay, how's that? Better? Walking around with the wand. Okay, we're going to have everybody share some of their discussion at their table. You guys want to go first? We're going to have everybody just share a little bit about your discussion and what you're thinking in terms of effect sizes or the distribution shift. And I know I was over here chatting with you for a bit, but for the rest of the group, No, this is good to check your own understanding. This is no better way than to explain it, right?
So just, I know he's got the notes. I think what was, just sort of really exciting to us as we spoke was in seeing this big growth in ELA, talking about what had happened. You were even asking what had happened. We
I
said,
learned
well,
something. I'm excited about it.
we added a new curriculum, but as Katie was sharing, the first, before the curriculum even got there, was professional development. And then the curriculum, kind of came in this year. And so a lot of the growth came from the professional development, and then in conjunction with the curriculum pieces. And so as a board, we're saying, so that was a huge investment, because when we approved that expense, we all kind of went, wow, that was a lot of money, because it was a professional development expense along with the materials. And so to see that we have a return on investment in year one, and right here, is exciting and meaningful, and I think it really then shows how do you, and then we just talked about how you keep seeing the growth, so.
So I'm just going to add a little
Yeah,
bit
yeah.
to that, because I didn't know that you had a new curriculum brought in, okay? So one thing to be mindful of this year. Well, this year, the curriculum, last year was the PD, okay? I'm lumping that together, but the PD obviously was a very critical part of it, okay, last year. So something to be mindful of is your norms are pre-COVID norms that you're looking at. So when you see that blue growth, that's looking at academic growth compared to how students were growing pre-COVID. If you brought, or you're bringing in, this is post-COVID, 21, 22, you start with professional development, 22, 23, it's going to start showing up in the classrooms. That's being compared to your old curriculum, your old way of doing business, of teaching. So that is really interesting to see that just from the first stage of the professional development as a way to bring that, don't just throw the curriculum out there and have teachers go at it. Let's get the teachers to do some different, practice and behavioral pieces, and that's showing up. So when you say, well, how did you do this? What happened? That's a direct reflection of that investment. Now, there's other things that were going on, but that's hard to argue. If you know you did something, because it's systemic, why else would we see that at a district level shift? It has to be a district-wide change to have that sort of an impact. And you're seeing that now. Now let's see what happens with this upcoming school year, with the students now, right? And be mindful. No, it is atypical, and often you'll see a dip. We know that when it actually gets into the classrooms, that implementation dip is very common, but know that you have a framework to actually help monitor that. Don't wait till the end of the year to say none of it worked. If it's not working in the fall, you have a chance to say, let's dig in and see what's going on. Are teachers implementing it right? Are the resources there? What's happening in the winter? And you use it to guide and to make your adjustments. So think of it as a guide. I call it a flashlight, a floodlight. It will shine the light. So if this were all set up in the beginning, and we're before the school board asking for a lot of money to bring this whole new program, this new curriculum and PD on, and you obviously got them to say yes, so what's the goal? What are we doing with this? What's our goal? The goal might have been, we expect to see accelerated learning, right? So we're looking at this sort of retrospectively now, but you're in the middle of it. So this is the power of having a sensitive framework, because it's picking up. And if you're doing something new across the district and you have pre-COVID earlier norms that did not have that, you have this wonderful comparison. You have this control group that you're comparing something that big to.
Well, and I also think it gives us the confidence to move forward in the same way with other curriculum that we
Right.
will need, right, moving forward, right? We have 6 through 12 ELA coming. We have math review. We have dual language review. And if we know that an investment can be impactful like this right from the start, as a board member, it makes me feel confident in the decisions supporting those kind of resources moving forward.
And knowing that if it doesn't happen right out of the gate, that doesn't mean it's a bad program and throw it out. It means the administrators and the educators have to roll up their sleeves and dig into it. Is it being administered with fidelity? Are they were they trained? The professional development, was it in place? Are the resources there? You dig into it.
We'll be able to see using this program classroom level data, which classrooms are growing at a higher rate,
Yes.
and which student groups and who's using it.
Right.
So,
So we'll go right into your table then, if you'd like.
Before we go into that, I'd like to highlight what Kara was saying. Yes, we invested financially, but the huge investment is the focus of the professional development and our people actually going to those professional development sessions, knowing how to implement the new curriculum and being confident in, in the
Imagine sharing
classroom.
that with them
So,
and saying, look
that's
what
a
we got.
huge investment. Our people are our biggest investment, and it's their time
Right.
that they invested that was put to great use, and we can tie a one-to-one correlation to, which I think is a recognition point. You know what I mean? I want to say, you know,
And it'll motivate
congratulations to
them as
everybody.
well, to see that, that would motivate them moving forward,
That's
to
what-
know that you actually have something that's
That's why I'm
sensitive.
saying it, because Courtney just said about other programs, I'm like, you know, yes, curriculum, but yes to professional development, yes to however we did it, so that we had people committed to go into the professional development and knowing, yeah, what.
It's a tremendous story.
I mean, I think it's also just a nod to this particular board and their willingness to think about the things that we've presented to them as it relates to utilizing our greatest resources, being human capital resources, in a very thoughtful way. And so, as you just mentioned about a recognition to the administration, I think every administrator in this room wants to recognize our board for their ability to be able to see that and to support that work. Even just most recently, we brought forward a decision to think about how do we look at our our admin structure at our building, and how are we potentially using roles to expand the instructional leadership teams across our building that provides that further direct support of instruction that happens in the classrooms. And so, I mean, you just, with this framework, it just allows us to continue to come back to the question, is it working, and how do we know? And if not, and if we think about the cycle of continuous improvement that our strategic plan has outlined, the key pivotal part of that is oftentimes the reviewing, the pausing, the intentional pause to say, did what we applied and the work that we put in place, how is that getting us to the intended outcomes? Or, and I like that you said, or not, and what information is that also telling to us to allow administration and teachers and educators to go back in and do some further root cause analysis and digging around that. So it just, the information just allows us to be even more, intentional about what we are doing and how we're measuring the outcome and the impact of that.
Good.
So
Right.
thank you to our board.
So what we talked about, I hope it's what you were expecting us to, but we were doing it both at a district level, but also a building level, because we want proficient and growth. So we've got some buildings that are proficient but not growing, so that they maintain the proficiency or outpace it, and the opposite. So we were looking at it from, maybe not complex, but I'm going to use it that way. It's not just simple. It's we want the entire district to move up, right? And so we have to look at if we look at all of our students, then we have to look at proficiency and growth and what's going on.
Was
Do you
there
see what I'm
anything?
saying?
So
So
yeah,
that
was there-
they all raise.
Right, so was there
raise up.
anything surprising in any of, at the building level, in terms of the proficiency level and whether they were growing as expected or higher than expected? I'm just wondering if there was anything that stood out? Nothing? Majority of them are blue. It's hard because most of them were growing at higher rates and some were maintaining.
They were, and some of them were negative, though. So then, it gets into where is that?
They're still in the
And
river if
we-
it's green.
Correct.
Yeah, they're
Correct.
still in the
But we're-
expected range, but if they
Cor-
keep going
Yep,
negative.
you got it. You got
It
it.
could drop. So you pay
Yep.
attention to that, but there's nothing that says, They're not growing as expected. If it's between the absolute values of 0.3, that's just, it could be random fluctuation. It's just normal fluctuation. It's when it gets, but if it's approaching the absolute value of 3 and it's a negative 3, you know, don't wait till the end of the year. Start digging in. Find the kids that are not growing and start digging into what other insights do we know about them.
And also, what we talked about is focusing where, you know, we know that, you know what I mean? Like, we use this data to identify that and ensure that we focus that, building that
Right.
level, that area.
And our next exercise, I want to make sure we have enough time for it, is on proficiency as well. But you're looking at it the right way, growth and proficiency together. But this same framework will help you set growth goals as well as your aggregate proficiency goals. Okay, I'm going to come over to this table.
A lot of what we talked about has already been said, of course, the appreciation for measuring the impact of decisions. We talked about the curriculum instruction side, but really getting down to staffing too, and seeing which interventions are working where, and then making decisions when you identify gaps. But also kind of keeping the value in understanding that all kids are different, and it's not a one-size-fits-all model. And so an intervention that might work for a student that's demonstrating an extreme amount of growth might not work for another student who's struggling in a different way in the same subject. So what we kind of got to was that building level utilization of how this has potential to create a level of collaboration among educators to share ideas and experiences with different learners and raise, you know, the amount of tools in their toolkit to work with all different types of kids and all kids who are challenged by different things. So that's pretty exciting when you think about that building level and the advantages to teachers. The other piece that we mentioned that might not have been mentioned yet is that, you know, I think districts sometimes worry about, or you talk to parents about, kids who might be quote-unquote falling through the cracks or not identified. And this model really focuses on individual students, and it helps us maximize our value of being a K through 12 district, so that we're able to follow kids K through 12, see where some hiccups may lie just through their own growth and development and natural growth and development, right? But the amount of information that you can get on individual students, I think, is a lot more than you can if you're a teacher in a classroom with 25 students all year. Just a better understanding of who they are as learners, I think I appreciate the most out of this, and what their experiences have been. So yeah, overall, you know, happy to see, of course, the higher percentage of high growth district-wide, and of course, we can come up with a few reasons of why that was there. But thinking through that, you know, 3-4 years from now, what do these percentages look like and where do our kids fall? And that idea of raising the bottom,
Right.
and also providing rich and rigorous curriculum for all, and then continuing to challenge the top, the higher achieving students too. It just kind of is a nice way of laying all of this out in a consumable, data-driven picture, if I could say picture.
And it's a very rigorous analytic model, but we simplify it with the schemas of just color coding and help. There's the thresholds, but rather, you know, people understand that, the 0.30, but people just refer to it as I have blue growth, green growth, because they know they're trained on the growth schema to keep it simple. There are no invisible kids in a framework like this. If there's kids falling through the cracks, it's going to show. You're going to see, whoa, because as soon as you think of that, where I had the growth scatter, and we were looking at, to the left, the struggling learners that fell below the blue line, they were growing the wrong direction, they were falling short of their own projections. You can identify them. You can say, show me all the kids that had low growth, low propensity, and list them. If there's 20 students there, you can list them and then hit an insight button and say, what else do we know about them? Do they have an IEP? You can put multiple filters. Who's an English learner and has an IEP? You can start to layer different filter and criteria and really understand, okay, we don't know why these students are falling behind. They don't have an IEP. It doesn't mean they need one, but they're falling through the cracks. Let's dig into this. Maybe they do need another educational assessment to evaluate that. You know, we're not saying that they need an IEP, but they're falling through the cracks if that's what's happening. So,
And remind me, you might have said this in the beginning part of your presentation, but I'm forgetting. The standardized tests that are being used. Can you tell us which ones those are again in this
End
data
of
model?
EA MAP, IAR, and PSAT.
And PSAT, okay, thank you.
And what we're looking at now is just a, I'm sorry, Kevin. Yes, what we're looking at now in the growth is just IAR 4.8 and PSAT 9. It should be on that front page. In every packet, so you understand, every one of these summary reports when we run growth, you're looking at a district level report, but every building, the principal gets their own building level report that cycles the same way, it's just their building information. So it'll have their building overall by each subject, and then each grade level, and then the subgroups, the student groups within there. So a principal can very quickly see, where do I need to, third grade's an issue, it's yellow. Or, wow, you know, fifth grade's blue, let's go. It's not meant to be a hammer, it's meant to be a flashlight. Shine the light, lead with data, lead with evidence to go and look, where do we need to allocate resources, where might there be something we can learn from because they're accelerating learning. It would certainly drive, if I were a principal and I had this sort of data, it would drive my walk-ins. If I'm walking through and I want to pop in for an observation, I know where I'm going. I want to see who's accelerating learning, right? Because I want to share that. Likewise, if I see yellow or red growth, I know where I'm going. We need to help. We need to figure out what this is, what's going on. And sometimes they know right away, yes, there's been 5 substitutes all year long. That's why that growth is something like that. Again, it gives you visibility into things that you've never had visibility in before. And the transparency that's needed at the student level is critical because, and you've heard me say this, you're going to improve this district one student at a time. Setting these big aggregate shifts are great, but you're going to do it one kid at a time. So you need to have the transparency into each student.
Well, and coming out of, you know, COVID and being able to really customize, you know, as we're looking at this data, you know, were there concepts maybe that were missed, or like in the younger grades for ELA, we know there was some foundational skills that our educators are working on because it was difficult for them to learn online during that time. So, you know, it just helps to really customize those efforts for professional development, for what our leaders and our administrators are doing in those buildings. And no two buildings are exactly the same. And so I just like how it helps us really hone in and customize what we're doing for students in different.
And then the younger in the primary grades where they really, during the worst parts of COVID, were impacted, maybe don't have those foundational skills for reading that are necessary. You would start to see these students are struggling, and you can dig into the assessment to understand what parts of the reading test are they struggling on.
Right.
Good. So that's an example of growth. This report would be ran at each iteration, so fall, winter, spring, and then again at the end of the year after the state tests come in. That wraps the whole year. We use all of that data at the individual student level. We recalculate every student's propensity score, and they get a new propensity score for the upcoming school year. Okay. The idea of the growth norms and being able to compare pre-COVID and what you're making these changes, eventually if you continue to have blue growth at the district level for 2 or 3 years, you're cheating yourselves if we don't renorm you, right? Because now that's who you are. So then you get renormed and you come back to 0 again and you're green again, and then you're off to the races to outperform it. It's an improvement model because you don't want to keep looking at blue growth. Then you want to renorm. Kevin's like, don't renorm, I like the blue. Don't renorm. Right. All right, I'm going to switch you guys. We're going to move on to, so we'll come back to you at the end there about options. Oh, am I not able to? It's not advancing. No? Oh, wait. Yeah, it's still not. You check that. I don't think I did. Okay, so this is what we just did, so we'll advance past that one then. So thank you for sharing your discussions. So how do you use the same framework now to set your proficiency goals? Again, using personalized projections at the student level, this is what's really important. If we have this information at the student level and we know this was longitudinal records, that's what makes it helpful in terms of removing confounding factors. When you just look back at last spring and say, well, we had 55% of students meet proficiency, let's increase by 2%. you're confounding all sorts of variables that you don't even know what you're fighting against. There's demographic shifts, there's cohort effects, there's differential standards across grade levels. Some grade levels are harder to meet the proficiency bar than in others. They just are. You can see that in the state file. You can see that if you look at ISB. Fewer kids meet in one grade than another. So if all you're doing is looking back at last spring and saying we can increase from 55 to 57, you know, you're going to have to deal with all this. There are different groups of students. There's demographic shifts, cohort effects, lots of stuff, okay? That's the variation. It has nothing to do with your school performance. Using the projection-based goals at the district level, so we're going to do now, and then aligning similar goals down through the schools, through the buildings, that's evidence-based, and it's also more equitable because you're using the individual students' personalized projections and then setting goals just by aggregating the individual students up. So your next report here, you have this here, less colorful one, that's the projection report. We're going to take a look at what your current proficiency goals are, and maybe you want to pull the dashboard up, okay? And I want you to look at what your current proficiency goals are on the dashboard, and then we're going to compare it to this report, and I want you to do similarly, have some discussion about the report, look at it by grade level and by student group. Thank you, Rudy. Okay, I'm going to stand over here just so I can. Okay, so in this report, this is just for the sake of tonight's exercise, we're just looking at grades 3 through 8, and this is the IAR. Because we know we don't have projections to the college suite yet, we will be able to do that for next spring, for 2024. We'll be able to measure growth this spring. It's just that there were not predictors from grades 9 and 10 during COVID years, which we would have needed to build the models and then evaluate. So you'll get that after we get this spring. So on page 3, you're going to see your all subjects here, and if you turn to page 3 of this report, it's not what's up there. On the bottom, this has 3,278 students for this year's projections. Normally, you would get this report in the beginning of the school year, okay? But we're just joining you now, so we've done this now. Normally, you would have a lot of time to act, okay, to have this information and be proactive. If you look at the very bottom row, that center number that's bold is 50%. This is across all subjects. And then there's a standard error of plus, minus, +1, -1 standard error. So it's 49 to 51%. That's across all subjects in grades 3-8 on IAR that's expected. Let's turn the page to something more actionable. That's by subject, because you're going to take actions differently, you know, based on math and ELA. So looking at ELA, there's your buildings. And if you look at all the projected to meet benchmark, that center number is what the model's projecting, and it gives you the standard error, meaning anything within that standard error is typical. That's just normal random fluctuation. If you want evidence that you're adding value and that your school improvement efforts are having a positive impact, you have to beat the model. It means you have to outperform the upper standard error. Okay? If you look at that bottom row, this is for ELA. Dead center in the middle is 51%. You're going to say, well, that's less than we actually achieved last year. Last year on ELA, we had 53.5% of students meet. Why would our goal be less? That's not your goal. That's telling you that given everything we know, now the model's smart enough to know that that's not likely to continue. That type of gain and what was experienced, it's smart enough to know that that might not be something that is realistic, that you would continue those sorts of gains year after year. It's going to study, it's looking longitudinally at all the data and your local norms, and it's saying, given what we know of how students performed, what's most likely is they're going to be somewhere between 50 and 52% at the district level. If you want to set a goal, my recommendation would be to outperform that and say we need greater than 52%. So let's look at what you actually have here for IAR. Oh, I think we have to. Are you there? Can you click on that tile, the IAR tile? So, and hover on the 2022 ELA. Is that, what's that one? 53.5. Okay, that's reading. Okay, 53.5, and then go back then to, if you just hit that back arrow and go back to the tile. And you're saying 2.4%, and that's just across, that's across everything, just 2.4? Math as well, or reading? What'd you do for math? Okay. Does anybody already see a problem with that? What is it? Where'd that number come from? It's so precise. I'm just curious. 2.4. You just. Where'd it come from? Does someone know? No, this is yours. This is your dashboard. That's, I'm just wondering where that actually did come from.
10% growth over 2 years of the 53. So it was, we took 5.3% divided by 2 over the course of 2 years. Or it would be 4.8, because we did math and ELA together.
Okay. Okay, so I understand where it came from. So
you
let's look at that. If you have 53.5, add your 2.4, that would put you at 55.9, right, for ELA? Let's look at what the model's projecting, between 50 and 52. Yeah. You might have hopefully you get there. And given that now what I learned, that you actually do have curriculum this year and you had the professional development, that maybe that's not outrageous. What we would have set for last year, you blew that out of the water, but now we use that information about how the kids performed last year, and that is reflected in here, because it used each and every student, so it's already captured that growth. And it's projecting somewhere between 50 and 52%.
Can I ask that you explain that again? So if we're at an average of 53.5% proficiency in this year, why would that proficiency rate go down?
So 53.5 is the percent of students that met the proficiency bar in spring of 2022.
Right.
Okay. Again, different grade levels, different standards, demographic shifts. If you just try to increase that number, you're confounding a lot of variables that have nothing to do with your improvement efforts. But, I mean, I'm sure you'd want that number to be 95%.
Of course.
Right? We want that, but the way to get there is to use some evidence-based approach to set things that help you know if what you're doing is working. It's not just aspirationally where we want to be. You can put a line in here, your benchmark, and put aspirationally where you want to be, and that would be a line across here. I'm not sure who's building these charts. Did you build them? Good for you. Good for you. So you just add another series and you can add a target that you want, and it would be a line across all of those. And you can set that aspirationally if you want that at 90%, or you can set that you're 10% over so many years, and then you're tracking, your bars are tracking toward that benchmark, right? So you can, I would set what you're doing as your benchmark, not your annual goals. Set your annual goals based on the data. And so the data is saying if you do nothing different, what I've learned tonight, though, is you've done something different. My recommendation would be you outperform the model, and by what magnitude, that's going to depend. The only way you're going to shift the model is do something different that adds value above and beyond. This is anchored to your local norms and your kids. There's nothing in here arbitrary. This is your data for every student that's in here, based on their performance.
Your question, does your model do any sort of, and I know it's only like the first or second batch of data that's been accumulated for our district, it sounds like so far, but does it give longer than 1 year projections?
So not typically, because if you think about it, people will say, well, why don't you go like from second grade to fifth grade? We can build models that way, but there's so much learning that occurs, especially even in the younger grades. The growth is so much more rapid usually at the younger grades. They're not the same student. We found that it's best to look one prior year. Your norms are built on multiple years. We study multiple cohorts so we understand what the typical trends are. That's how we set those standards, those norms. But each year we look back 1 year at a student. You don't want to take too much baggage, especially students that are being served with supports and interventions. You don't want to anchor them to something that they've already outgrown or passed, so you want to always look at the most recent year. But there could be 6, 8, 9 data points depending on if they're taking the state tests, like grades 3, 8. They would have reading and math in the fall, reading and math in the winter, reading and math in the spring, and then reading, writing, math in the spring with a state test. They could have 8, 9 data points in there. It's very robust. So if a student didn't feel good, or something, alarm went off, fire alarm went off, disrupted kids in the middle of a test, they're rock solid. They're much more robust because there's multiple data points from different time periods. And the propensity is very powerful. It captures all the predictive information from all of those individual test points, and we just create the composite score with it. Yes, Karen?
So would we want to then, as a district, and I don't know if this is even possible, but, I mean, you want your proficiency goal, I mean, you're aiming for 100%, right? I mean, like, that's the goal. But then separately, you would be wanting to track and then look at a cohort of students. So if a third grade, for instance, you would want to look then, we hope they're growing at the same rate they grew the year before or better, or, you know, like, would you do it by grade level, or you just kind of do it district-wide and make it an average, like what you've done? Or do you separate a proficiency goal and a growth goal, or how?
Right, because
can
growth
you
is the
talk
means to getting more students proficient. So you're going to monitor the growth multiple times throughout the year, and whether they're at proficiency at each of those times, because that bar is all equated to the spring bar. But realistically, you're not going to get 100% of the students in 1 year. So you can have an aspirational bar. I wouldn't even recommend putting 100, because why put it there then, right? Put something that maybe you're looking at over the next 5 years of, you know, maybe getting from 55 to whatever it is, you know, if you're looking at a 10-point gain or something, and then your bars will just shift under that line. But growth ties into your school improvement. Okay, that means you're using it to know if what you're doing is working, so that you can either keep doing that or stop doing it and bring in something else that's showing that it's adding value, because you have to accelerate growth for the students that are not proficient. You want to maintain or accelerate all growth, of course, for kids that are already proficient. So that's why you need to make sure you have transparency into all students. But to increase your aggregate levels of proficiency, you have to find those students that aren't there and grow them faster. So you do that annually. You're setting your goals annually. You're bringing in what are my improvement? What is each building working on? What are we doing different this year? If you just come in and open the doors and do the same thing, this is what you're going to get. You're not going to get anything different. Okay? You have to do something different.
That's a really important point in all of this, is that when you maintain status quo, the projection is saying, if you were to copy what you did this year and do it again next year, this is where your proficiency would be.
Right.
As a board, we're deciding, and in partnership with the administration and their recommendations usually, that we're doing things differently to accelerate that growth. It's a
Right.
very key point in all of this, I think, that we need to make sure we continue to highlight. Right.
And you have
we're trying to
evidence
accelerate
already
growth.
of one of those decision points
Yeah.
with the professional development, and then, you know, you're right. Right. Okay, so ELA, you might want to consider looking at again. And then let's take a look at math. The next page here on page 5, math is between 49 and 51%, so it's smack in the middle at 50%. That's across the district. And you can see the difference at buildings. If everybody, like if you're just slapping a 2.4% on at the district level, what are you telling the buildings they all have to do? Right? Because they all have to do something different. They're not all going to be expected to get to the same. If you look at their projections, their goal should be, each principal should be trying to outperform their building's projections. That's what's equitable. They shouldn't be told, I have to grow 15, we all have to be at this, so I have to grow. Well, I can sit back because I'm already above that, and I have to grow 20 points. Look at what's projected for their students in their building based on their students' performance, and then beat that projection. So it would be to outperform, you know, more than one positive standard error of the projection. What gets tricky if you pluck a number out of a projection report, it's based on the students. So there's 3,278 students. If 100 of them don't test, these numbers might shift slightly, but that would, when at the end of the year this gets resolved, this packet gets updated with the right column filled in, and if that count shifted, you're going to say, well, wait a minute, what happened to our 49, 50, and 51? You just have to be mindful that that's part of the framework. It's based on, the equation has the number, it's over the number of students. So you just want to make sure you're outperforming more than one positive standard error.
Are we going to be able to get to all of our students at one point?
What? Wait, what do you mean? Oh, yeah, yes. Yeah. Yeah. This is only IAR 3.8 for tonight. Right. That's it. And MAP, if you administer K-8 MAP.
So once we have, as Dr. Semenik was saying, once we have the PSAT suite in here, that'll add the high school. And then once we have the MAP data in here, that'll be lower.
You go to
And
whatever
so
grade level it
there'll
goes
be
to.
more data in here. It'll be far more robust
And that'll be when?
in the fall.
They're taking them now in spring. So we'll get them after, in the summer, whenever yeah. And then it would come out for the next year. So again, if you go through there, then you can see grade levels. You'd be able to set goals by grade levels. It gets very micro. The back 2 pages are your student groups. So if you can go back, Rudy, once to the tiles again, I noticed that you also have some goals in here on your demographics. It says IAR demographic gap reduction goal, increase plus 3% increase for low-income English learners and IEP students that meet expectations on IAR. Don't make me laugh, Keisha. I'm not laughing, I'm laughing with her.
I'm actually going to point out that the IAR plus 2.4% wasn't quite that far off, because we were averaging the math and
You
ELA.
might be right on.
We were, so I just want to point out that, there was a lot of time and intention set towards these goals, and I will say we did get pretty close, albeit a masterful algorithm that you're using. But I think because our intent was that, especially with math being at 48.4% last year, that is where we were hoping to see the biggest increase on average. We were recognizing that that was an ambitious goal to also increase ELA at 53.5, but there was also some time and attention for that demographic gap goal. So if you do want to click on it, it might be off, but
It would be pretty close, so, because I did some quick calculations just on my page here. So for ELs, hello, check? Okay. I'm on page 9 right now. I'm looking at math on page 9 in the report. And so I'm looking at the top, the English learners. The projection is, if I'm looking to beat the model, I want greater than 14%, because it's projecting somewhere between 10 and 14. If I look at your data, you had 10.6 EL in the spring of 22, right? What'd you have? Oh, you're on low income. Go to English learner. 11.9. Okay, so it's my numbers are slightly off. 3% would put you at 14.9, 15%. So that's not off. I mean, that's pretty close, because the model's saying exceed 14%. Okay, and then your low income. What's your IEPs? You can, whatever you're hovering on, we'll go with. It's 19.4. So you add 3, 22.4, and that's probably high, right? No, IEP greater than 22. Okay. And then low income was the next one, right? What was that one at? 23, so 26. Low income, that's maybe high for low income. Because it'd be 23 plus 3, be 26. Well, the model's saying anything over 20 is going to show evidence that something is working, that you're adding value above and beyond. It's a matter of knowing what you're doing, how you're serving the students. Are you doing something different? Are you providing additional support? Okay. And then similarly with, the ELA. But you see the difference here? So you weren't far off on all. Some you might be overshooting, but now you have a comparison, and you see there's a different way to set them that is really going to help you. The goal is, the foundational purpose of setting goals is not just to put what your aspirations are. That's a benchmark or a target you're trying to hit. The purpose of setting goals every year is to help inform what you're doing, so you know what's working and what's moving the needle for kids, and you want to be able to do more of that or change it if it's not working. You know, you try to fix if something isn't working, you dig into it, but after a couple years, if you continue to not get the right return, people usually will then shift and say, let's reallocate this to something else. For whatever reason, we can't implement it. It's not working right. Okay, so we can go back to the slides. So just thoughts. I know it's a little bit past 7. I'm not sure how your time is, but just maybe thoughts. We do this together if you want. Is that better, just to talk anything additionally on the proficiency here? we'll just do some sort of a commentary, or do you see how this might serve you better than the arbitrary goals?
Yeah, if I can jump in, sorry. I just, I think, when you look at proficiency specifically by school, there's a wide range of difference in, say, the middle schools or K through 5 schools when in comparison. And so I think the uncomfortable piece, and I'll just speak for myself, of just seeing that variance in our district is what creates a sense of urgency for us to talk about how do we accelerate growth for students who are in that wide variance, right? That they're just throughout the wide variance, and how do we close that variance a little bit? Or a lot of bit, I would say, sorry, I don't want to speak out of turn. So that piece is the concern, but I'm appreciative of the ability to use this to help us create more accurate, achievable measures. And if we keep that focus on beating the model, because if we're implementing changes that work for kids, that should be the overall goal. And so it takes the focus off that number. It brings us to a default of growth for all, and then accelerating that in all areas across the board, but specifically in the ones that we identify as highest priority.
And really being of the mindset to think about why you're setting goals. The goal isn't just to set some aspirational goal that, we are Elmhurst, we should be at 85%. The annual goal-setting process is to inform if your improvement efforts are working. So that's a mind shift. You can have your benchmark of your aspirationally where you believe you should be, and we'll have you add a line. We'll have you add a line to your charts, because then you can see where you're tracking toward that. But the annual goal-setting process should be anchored to the data and the evidence that allows you to make better informed decisions about your improvement efforts. Any other thoughts or comments? Yes, Kara?
No, I just, I guess something that kind of goes with the dashboard, and, I love the model, and then being, saying we want to hopefully exceed our growth projections, but how do you communicate this? I mean, because, we just dug in, right? And how do you,
She's listening.
You're awake?
You should have
You're
taken
awake now.
notes.
Because, I think too, it's hard, there's a lot of things that go into a student hitting their proficiency, right? We've just looked at a lot of factors, even just down to if the fire alarm went off on test day and everything else was in alignment. If that fire alarm went off and that distracted them, then they didn't do well. So how do you communicate this so that you're showing that, there's an intentionality that's going into this, because as a board, you make some big decisions, like the curriculum is a big decision to me, but then there's smaller decisions that are also happening, and you want to know return on investment on all of them, right? Adding a math specialist, and how does that impact? And so I guess, how do you communicate
The goal
on a
part?
dashboard, the goal
'Cause
that,
that's what I'd focus on. I
yeah,
wouldn't go down
the
a-
goal, yeah, because, how do you communicate
So,
it?
and I'm curious, do you currently communicate your MAP NWEA goals? And what do you share with that? How do you communicate that? Percentage of students that met their MAP growth? Yeah. No? You show their tracking. So we have lots of charting tools, if you might remember, within local and national, that some really cool stuff that can be presented to the board around that. But go ahead, Keisha.
So I think this is a learning opportunity for us because we are considered a high-performing district. And I think you hit the nail on the head when you said this is a shift in mindset. And so the administration did our best to show growth over time from year to year. So as we shared our winter MAP data, it was growth from year to year. And then how how that rolled up to that proficiency and the percent of students as measured by proficiency. So those have been the two ways that we've communicated that MAP data.
So you would continue to communicate your MAP data like you are and sharing national performance. You wouldn't change that because that's of real interest. That's looking out the window. How do they perform relative to others in the nation? But if you're talking about the dashboard and setting these sorts of improvement goals, you can shift from reporting, national percentiles and the percentage of students meeting on that test to just saying we're taking a very personalized approach to student learning, and we are personalizing projections based on every individual student's performance, and then we're going to aggregate that up, and we have some expectation given what we're studying the data. We're looking at this through a more data-driven lens. And based on the data that we're looking at, we have some projection of where we're likely to land given what we're looking at. And our goal is to outperform where we're expecting to land just given what's historically happened.
Yeah.
And our aim is to outperform that because, and you think of that theory of action research, if I implement some new strategy, then I would expect to see accelerated learning. So you have to link it to what your improvement efforts are again and say, we're bringing in new initiatives, we're going to bring this in, and because of that, we expect to outperform what our local trends have shown. I would try to report it through the lens of looking at local trend data and that you're taking a much more data-driven approach. I wouldn't try to get into the modeling and the effect size. That's a lot, the propensity score. It's an improvement model for the educators, the administrators, right? And the board, you need to know what's behind it all. You need to understand it. But broader than that, it's a lot to communicate, and it's not necessary. It's really an improvement framework, and it's tools for you to make better decisions based on data. And I would try to explain it through the lens of we're just going to look at data differently. We're going to start studying our local trends and looking at every individual student's longitudinal trend of performance, and then with that we're able to come up with this aggregate level of what's likely to occur in our district, and we're going to aim to outperform that given the new improvements that we're bringing each school year.
I was just going to follow up. So, hearing maybe what improvements have been done, even sometimes at a school level.
Oh yeah,
And then,
sharing
like what did or didn't,
Yeah.
hey, we met our growth projection or we exceeded it, hopefully, are the two conversations.
I mean,
Not we didn't, but
go ahead.
Yeah.
Can I also just add, I picture this as a series of conversations, because having used this model before, people become very familiar with we want to be in the blue. We're really focused on blue is where we want to be. All of your teachers get really excited about that, and that becomes the focus of conversations. How are we going to get our students in the blue? What does that really look like? And then when they see their growth in the green, it's like, oh, the students in the green, that's really good, but how could we be better in the blue? Or when our reports come back in the yellow.
The yellow or red, yeah.
What does that look like? How do we improve? And then an additional series of conversations. So we're going to be having these conversations with you as a board team. We are additionally going to be having these conversations with our principals and our building level leaders. We expect that our building level leaders will be turning around and having individual conversations with their building teams. And then those building teams would even turn into individual conversations with teachers to say, let's look at Dr. Gren's growth in his classroom over the last year and where his students are performing, for this year, where their projected growth are. So if our average class size is like 22, that's like, 3 to 4 students who are projected to be in the low growth range. So we have to think about that for one teacher in one of our classrooms to think through what that's going to look like. How do we move them into the average to above average range? And it's a series of individual conversations about moving them from the red or yellow growth into the green or blue growth.
Kevin, the really important points, and something as for the board, you will see yellow and red when they're sharing growth with you. That will happen. So we're looking at the high district level. It's something very unusual that has made the systemic shift for you in the district. As you start to peel the onion and they start to look at the growth within the buildings and then within the grade levels in the buildings and then within, classrooms and then within student groups, all different colors go off, okay? You start to peel the onion, and all the variance starts to show, and that's the power of the model, because you want to get down to the individual student level. You want to help the teachers who might be struggling. Maybe it's a second-year, first-year teacher, and they need more coaching or mentoring. But don't get overly, what we don't want it to be is a hammer, because it's not helpful to anybody. And Kevin, what you said was really important, because you want to scaffold this. This is not something you go and open the doors and everybody gets growth out of the box. They would be terrified. They wouldn't even understand it. So ECRA's approach to this is starting at the district office, training so that you have the capacity and the understanding here, and then training within the buildings to build that capacity so it's sustainable. You don't want me here. You don't need ECRA here. You need to, it's something for you to learn, and we scaffold our PD with that in mind, that we start with the district office, and then you start to bring your principals in, and then maybe your next layer might be, you know, your coaches. And then it's a train the trainer within the buildings, and we're out. You want this to be sustainable. We want to build the capacity within your district for you to lead with that. You know, we're not here to tell you what to do. We're here to give you the data and the analytic framework to help you all do your jobs better with more evidence. Not that I don't like coming to you. I've really enjoyed meeting everyone. Thank you. Yes. I don't want to come back. No, okay.
Well, when you're talking about communicating, you know, to our community, I like the idea of, you know, as we make decisions here at the board table and things are put into place and we get recommendations from the administration, communicating out the why, you know, why those things are put in place, what that's looking like in our schools, and then to come back and circle back and talk about what that looked like as an outcome and how that worked in the return on investment. I think really those are things our community wants to hear. The decisions that we're making here, how are those affecting our students? What is our return on investment? How is it, you know, what are the outcomes of that? And sometimes it's going to be, well, we need to maybe make a shift, or maybe we need to add something to that. It's not always going to
Right.
be perfect. And I think that's good to communicate as well. I think, you know, our community wants to know the process. And so I think that's really important, aside from just the numbers. You know, we talked about these are each individual students and what we're doing for those individual students. I think that's just super important.
Right, and it's personalized, so all this
Right.
data is very
Yeah.
much personalized for each student. And one of the first things that I would consider sharing is what you see in that ELA as a direct result of the PD. And you might not see that come this, you know, after you get the IAR from this spring, if this is the first year that's in the classroom. You know, that's typical that there's an implementation dip. People are getting used to it, you know, and the teachers are getting used to it, and students are maybe learning differently. So again, it's meant to provide the guidance to know when you have to go in and start making adjustments. It's not what happened, it's not working. It's let's dig in and readjust. It's telling you we need to adjust, and you don't have to wait. Normally when you get rolling with this, you don't have to wait till the end of the year, because you're getting check-ins in the fall and the winter. Winters are great. If you drop any test, I would say do not drop your mid-year winter test. You're rudderless until spring, and then you're too late. You're looking back and go, oh, we couldn't do anything now because it's the end of the year. The winter test is the most important test in a process like this, because it gives you enough time to adjust. Okay? If you drop anything because you're looking for more instructional time in this kind of a framework, you could drop fall. We don't tell you you have to drop anything, but if there's discussions around that, because we project from the prior spring all the way forward, we're just saying the mid-year test is critical, or you're rudderless the whole year. There's nothing you can do. You won't know until spring, it's too late. And assessments, that's one area that we are experts in. So if you're looking at making adjustments, the only thing I'd say is pick up the phone and give me a call, and we can tell you what the consequences are if you're making a shift to your modeling and stuff like that. But there's nothing wrong with MAP's a great test psychometrically. It's a sound test. It models well, behaves nicely in this sort of a framework. You know, there's other tests that aren't as psychometrically sound, you know, that are more subjective, that don't model, we couldn't include. Any other thoughts, questions? I think for next steps, you can, you know, think about changing maybe, or considering growth goal. You don't have one yet, so maybe consider some sort of a growth goal using the data, and then maybe revisit your proficiency goals, or they're very close, but if anything, you have a comparison now and see where it comes in. You hope that you beat this model, and I hope it's by that much, right? It's a lot. But I do hope it's by that much, because you showed it's just amazing last year, so who knows? Who knows? I'm hopeful. I'll be checking. I'll be the first one. I'm excited to get your spring data, so I can't wait, because we'll be jumping for joy back at ECRA, and then can't wait to get it to you. No last questions? Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you. It's a pleasure meeting everyone.
Thank you very much. So really then for us is to kind of, not tonight I'm thinking because we've had a lot to digest, but we kind of agree on like using these projections and maybe coming up with agreeing that we want to maybe exceed the projection would be our goal. You know, kind of what she had on the slide by a standard, you know. And have that be our way, instead of saying like definitely a certain number, because it's different for each school. Is that, am I kind of, and then that would be our, you know, strategic plan piece. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you again. Thank you again. So, you know, I think that's in maybe a follow-up conversation, but just that's kind of that phase 3 tying, like what we as a board, correct me if I'm not capturing what everyone's thinking, is that we would want to definitely be meeting that, and we hope we're exceeding that growth goal. And then I think we have to talk about, you know, the proficiency piece.
I liked that idea of the target being the long-range goal, and then the, sorry, Scott, in the middle.
Could you just lay down on the?
And I wonder what you all thought about that too. If the targeting is that kind of longer range goal, I think it answers a little bit of the question that we get around, well, what is our capacity, right? What are students, like where could they potentially be in a period of time? So that there's this longer range target, but that we're incrementally looking at, I'll use the phrase beating the model, because we're in this moment of identified need for acceleration in student growth.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if there's agreement among the board members around that thinking, but if that's the direction that we'd like the administration to go in, then.
Yeah. So I think that, you know, yes, I don't need to say it again.
I think,
Anything else?
I think, yeah, I think just my question to the board with that direction, there has been a lot of time that has been spent on the development of the goals, and we know that it's it wasn't exactly aligned to the projection based on just the level of sophistication and analytics that went into what they are able to provide. Would you all like us to come back and reflect on that based off of what information we currently have? Or is there some thought as to that work after receiving spring summative? Okay.
Well, and
keep going. Okay.
And I don't think whatever we see in the spring is going to impact how we look at what our goals are going to be, right? Like a number that, and you know, the test results is not going to say, well, now we don't need this anymore, because this is something we'll need always moving forward. So I do think coming back with us sooner rather than later to re-examine how we're going to look at what we want those goals to be and how we want to identify them as opposed to what we have right now, I think would be helpful. I think that's the right step. I don't think we need to wait for scores, spring scores. Does that make sense? Did I say it wrong?
So you're saying use this and make some adjustments currently in the moment?
That's how I feel.
Where-
I'll speak for myself. That's
Okay.
how I feel.
Right,
Yeah.
meaning this data that we currently have.
To identify what we want our goals to be and what we, right, and where we want to go to.
I guess I just have a question on timeline. Like, so if we have established the goals, like, is the spring result going to have an impact on what that goal might be in the long run? Or what's the timeline?
But I-
Like, so if we establish a goal, is it for next school year? Is it
Well,
for?
my understanding is that this report gives us our spring proficiency projections,
Right.
which would be what these kids are taking right now. Right? Like, so if we don't need to wait for the numbers to say, our goal should be that we're meeting this now. And then another report's gonna come out after this, and that's gonna look different. And so we can still always say that we want our goal to meet or exceed the projected benchmarks identified in this report. I mean, I guess we'll find out really quickly if we did it this year, right, if that's the mentality. But I think for us to identify like a KPI, or, you know, an indicator, it can always be, we want to exceed the benchmarks as projected each year, in my mind. Am I saying that wrong?
But there's other goals that were written, right, that you guys worked on that are separate from that,
Right.
that are more,
There's tons of them. There's tons of them. Yeah.
yes. So we're not saying, I'm just trying to
Get rid of
clarify.
everything.
Right.
No, right, 100%.
We're just saying, and those, from what I was hearing, might be more lofty, ambitious. Right, so to keep those as our, like, you know, our high-end goals, our more ambitious
Aspirations,
goals,
yeah.
and then use this as our, you know, tracking device along the way, right?
Because I do think that if we have these, and we're realizing now that those goals that were selected are so aspirational, you know, I don't want our kids or our teachers to feel like they're failing if
Right.
they're growing. And if they are continuing to make progress and move forward, I don't want a teacher or a building principal or you, district team, to feel like, wow, we just failed. Because that's not what it is, right? Like, I do think growth is the key to success, and that doesn't always look awesome, like it's not the 100% proficiency that everybody pie in the sky, but I do think it's the key for all of our kids to succeed, and then when they're succeeding, we succeed. So I do think that those numbers are great to be like aspirational, but I do think centering our goal around exceeding the benchmarks from year to year, whatever they happen to be, based on how they performed the prior year, is a more realistic, successful way to judge success. That's my opinion.
And when do you get, like a new, like
She said over the
the
summer.
data projection?
Said each summer, right?
Well, prior to that, we have to bring a proposal to the board because we aren't in full partnership with them. So I think one step first would be to actually bring a proposed contract as to the continuation of the partnership. If we enter into that partnership with them, she has guaranteed that we would have that roll up as soon as the preliminary data is available, which oftentimes they have a relationship with NWEA as well as IAR, which they get that raw data before that data is actually made public. So we're thinking that we would have that by, you know, June, somewhere in June.
So we have this year, you know, they've run this for us initially, but then we would have to have a relationship to continue on. Okay.
And is it a annual, so summer we've talked about, we get a report then, right? Are there
Yeah.
any other reports throughout the year?
Yeah,
after
they
fall
do
or-
them three,
There's three
there
additional?
are three,
Total.
three total, so fall, winter, and then spring.
Summer.
Yeah, yes, used for, yeah.
Right.
Because like she mentioned, this data would normally be the first conversation in the fall to kind of know where students are being projected. in relation to what type of, supports that are being provided. So I think it's really, really powerful. When we think about the scatter plot, those students that are not on trend to have the expected growth, which falls into like our MTSS, like what supports is provided in our Tier 2, which we shared and talked with the board about previously.
And the reports are not,
Can you?
reports are not static. So the reports are always live for use by school leaders and teachers and that sort of thing. So like if I'm having a meeting with a parent and that sort of thing, I could pull up a student's report and go through, a student's growth report with a parent.
And then I think as we think about the math interventionist role as well, we would be using this data to ensure that we're creating appropriate caseloads so that we then can evaluate impact. So I think that June report is really, or early July, will be really critical in thinking about what do case looks look like, what grade levels do we particularly target, so that we can get sort of that robust planning started. So that will be really helpful as well.
I was going to say, I feel like this has been a challenge. This is my perception. It's been a challenge for us as a district. Like, we all want to be better, right? Always want to be doing better. And you do big things, like the curriculum is a great example of a big thing, but then these small things, how do you know that you're really getting the return on investment? And they add up, right, cost-wise. And sometimes you need them for a while, and then maybe you don't need them. So, yeah, I just, as we look at our performance and you're really digging into these, groups of students, the really small, we've done a lot of the big things, and over time, those big things, but now you're down to these small, smaller groups of really focusing on achievement. So, I guess I like that helps you make that, or understand what's going on.
And I think, Kara, that's a really good point, because, right, we decided this year to allocate math interventionists. And this will allow us the ability to see if that's impactful, and if it is, great. If not, we can pivot from that. And so when you talk about that minutia, that's what this will be able to expand on for us and make decisions for. So I think you're exactly hit that right on the head.
And to make sure that the decisions we're making are very intentional and focused on, students that we're trying to help grow. So I think that this data is really valuable.
Okay, so did we answer the question you needed answered? Yes. Okay, and then I just want to throw out there that there's still a lot of other parts of the strategic plan. I know, like this was just like the student data, and there's a lot of other data pieces that we need to come back to in another meeting and just kind of hone in, I think, on what, how we want to make sure those are measured and monitored. Is that fair? Which is a little different than this. So, okay. All right. Okay, anything else? Dina, Beth, Karen? Nope. Good. Okay. That's it. Yep. All right, so we are at the end of the agenda. We have a regular scheduled board meeting on April 25th, 2023 at 7 o'clock in District 205 Center. And coming to the end of the agenda, we are adjourned.